Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. My name is miahtheking, and I used to hate facial hair, but then it grew on me. Now then, today we're taking a look at a game just released on Steam this morning called Great Houses of Calderia, developed by Resistance Games and published by FireSquid. Love that name, by the way. Released in early access and selling for 25 American dollars. Now what if we took the highly acclaimed Crusader Kings genre of video gaming and combined it with Game of Thrones style politics and intrigue? Well, you'd probably get this game. It's a game in similar style to Crusader Kings, a large overmap that you overlook, too much information that you need to manage, war not being the main focus of the game, but management and resources and politics is the main focus of the game, with lots of big decision-making events that actually have consequences. It's a big micromanaging style strategy game, or just, a grand strategy style of game. That's what the genre is. You pick your house, you can name it whatever you want, you pick an emblem for your family, which is also fully customizable. You pick your starting location of where you're wanting to start off. You see, basically in this game, the emperor of your nation has this big old island that he wants to send a buttload of people of noble families to go to and to colonize it and manage it. And you're one of those families. That's pretty much it. Now lead your family to glory and honor and prestige, I guess. Okay, so up first, as always, is the positives. The very first positive I want to bring special attention to is the writing here. The lore, the story, it's all so well done. It's like reading a finely crafted fantasy novel, although I don't know if there are any magical or mystical creatures here, though I'd love to see a game like this, but in a fantasy setting. But the point here is the writing is incredible. It's detailed, it's not overly complicated, it's not too much. I didn't notice any typos or misspellings or anything like that. It's all just very well written, which is great considering most of the time here, that's what you're going to be doing, reading. The next positive point I would like to make is the setting and the idea here. Now, the Crusader Kings is a really good gaming franchise, and I always welcome new developers trying to tip their toe into the waters of grand strategy like this, but this game does it a little bit differently. Instead of being in charge of this large kingdom with all these different things going on, you're instead the head of a small noble house who must rise through the ranks, navigating political intrigue and any other situation that arises, all while trying to maintain your territory's prosperity. This is what gives it the whole Game of Thrones feel, and I actually kind of like this idea, which is why I put it in the positives for originality. The next positive I'd like to point out is the art style. Now, while the graphics aren't the best, and I'll go into that later, the art style of the portraits and the random images that the game throws at you are all so beautiful. They're so well drawn and detailed. They're nice to look at, but the best is that they seem to fit with the theme and the overall feel of the game that you're playing, so they don't even feel out of place or awkward or weird, which some games do end up doing unintentionally. And last but not least for the positives is the tutorial. Now, it's not the best, but it's not bad either. I would feel wrong putting it in the negatives, so I'm putting it here in the positives. It teaches you what you need to do with highlights, tooltip bubbles, and so on. It teaches you what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. It's a little bit too wordy, and it kind of comes and goes as needed, but, none of it felt unnecessary or confusing. And trust me, you're going to want a tutorial to learn how to play this game. I think the only negative about the tutorial that I really have to say is that it doesn't explain everything, and it only introduces a tutorial in certain situations. So that can make it a little bit more difficult to learn all the nuances of this kind of game when it's not teaching you every little detail. If you're going to have this much in your game, you should also explain that much of your game. Does that make sense? Alright, so that's all I got to say about the game. Now don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily a bad game, but when I look at it objectively and I break it down to its most basic points of pros and cons, well, it's hard for me to say it's a good game even though it's not a bad game. Does that make any sense? Now then, on to the negatives, but before that, my channel only gets exposure in the big wide world if my videos get lots of views, which means I really need the help of my supporters and viewers out there. Liking and subscribing and leaving a comment does help, but not as much as spreading the word of my channel. Get the word out, and I'll grow far faster and far more efficient. So please consider helping me spread the word today. Oh, and remember, this game is in early access, so a lot of the negatives that I'm about to talk about here are subject to change over time, but also being early access only gives you so much leeway. I'll give it a little depending on the situation, but, it's not an excuse in my book, not if you're going to charge me money. Okay, so up first for the negatives is the stability. The game didn't crash or break or have any bugs, so don't get me wrong, it's not the worst, but it moves at a crawl. It stutters and drops frames all the time, at least for me. It freezes all the time. The game is already kind of slow, yet it gets even slower when you have to deal with the constant stability slowing it down even more. Very frustrating and kind of giving me a headache half the time. Next up is the user interface. It's a bit crowded with too much information thrown at you. Now, I know that's typical for games like this, but that's not really the worst of it that I want to talk about. Some of the size of the different texts are different from others. Some icons are smaller than others. And it's so hard to see some things, and it's hard to navigate through these things, and harder to manage everything because of the disheveled organization of the user interface, which makes this already complex game even more complex and confusing. The next negative I have is the gameplay. Now, for the most part, this is fine. It's not turn-based, it's live action with speed settings, which is fine. Managing your territory and your people is more or less fine as well. But what you're watching right now is pretty much the entirety of the gameplay. I mean, oh, okay, they do have this annoying little minigame to mix things up every now and then. Now, I personally hate this minigame. It's awkward, it's boring, and the way the enemy tiles just blip around avoiding you and stealing everything, not turn-based and hard to organize the order people move or do stuff or whatever, and in my opinion, it's just a very badly designed and implemented minigame. And yet this is how negotiations are handled, or battles in war are handled. It's very unsatisfying, awkward, annoying, and boring. So I just auto-resolve them to get rid of them because it's just so damn annoying to play. Overall, for the gameplay, it's slow and it's boring for the majority of my playthrough, and thanks to that minigame, I don't really expect it to get much better. The only fun stuff with the gameplay was the managing of my city and the random events that popped up, which made me make choices that actually had consequences. But otherwise, you're waiting for resources and other things to happen before you can finally actually do something. Up next is the lack of sound effects, ambiance, and the kind of lackluster music. The music was uninspired and forgettable in my opinion. It drifted into the background and then I completely forgot about it. The sound effects are almost completely lacking. I can't remember any. And as far as I could tell, there was, no ambiance either, which made the game feel dead and even more boring. It's bad enough I gotta look at this map and wait for something to happen, but not being able to listen to anything while nothing is happening just makes it worse. The graphics aren't that great either. Now, don't get me wrong, the color scheme and the detail of the portraits and of the user interface are fine, but I mean, look at the map. To me, it looks ugly. Low texture, bad lighting, bad coloring, bad contrast. It's just, to me, in my opinion, it's really ugly to look at. And last but not least for the negatives is the price tag. An early access game lacking in voice acting, lacking in compelling gameplay, stability, sounds. It's too much lacking. It's too much. I mean, if this game was selling for $20, I might be a little bit more forgiving, but we're talking $25 here. It's just a little bit too much for what's currently there. I mean, you're charging us to beta test your unfinished, broken, buggy game. Why charge us so much for it? I've seen bigger and better games sell for less, so I just don't understand. Alright, so that's all the negatives I got to say about the game, and yeah, I know, there's a lot more negatives than positives. So is it an awful game? I mean, it's awful, right? Well, no, not entirely. Look, the game clearly has a lot of issues, but it's early access, right? So it does get some leeway. And yeah, I agree. However, it feels to me like the negatives far outweigh the positives here. Now, maybe if the game was smooth as silk in its stability, maybe if it had more of a fun minigame with a little clip of battle or something, maybe if it looked a bit nicer, had a cleaner UI, I might be able to agree with its price tag and say it's a nice little game. But I'm sorry to say, I was bored, I was annoyed, I was confused. Even after playing for over an hour and a half, I was still lost on some of the most simple instructions the game wanted. It wasn't that nice to look at or listen to, and I was starting to get a headache from all the stability stuttering. But is it a bad game? I don't really think so, but it's not good either. It's hard to tell with it being early access, but honestly, I think the game could end up being really fun and really interesting once it's finished. But to me, in its buggy, unfinished state, it has a lot of work to do before it's worth its asking price. I mean, Crusader Kings 3 is only $10 more than this, and it's fully finished and a far more satisfying experience. This game has a lot of potential, but as of this moment, right now, I don't think it is worth our time and money. Wait half a year and see the updates it's made, and then check out if you're super interested. But it's really slow, it's lacking in a lot of interactive gameplay mechanics, and when you do finally get to do something interesting like trade negotiations or combat, you're faced with this kind of lackluster minigame. I hate to put down this game because even though I've got more bad to say than good, I still don't really think it's a bad game overall. It's just, I don't know, it's just put together rather haphazardly, at least in my opinion. I loved Crusader Kings, but I just couldn't really get into this one. I probably could once it's finished, but right now I was just bored and annoyed. So take that as you will. If you still want to give it a try, then I hope you enjoy it, but also be aware of what you're getting into. And if not, well, I'd understand. So that's all the time I got for this video, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I can't wait to see you all again on my next adventure. So until then, I bid you all farewell.